So we are going to start by, I'm going to ask to all the table leads to report, I'll bring you a microphone, to report back to the team on what your table has discussed. I know we could be here talking a lot longer about that. So I'll start with Andrew Lawrence from the NZ Bank.
Hello.
Right. Afternoon, everyone. Just in case you're wondering why there's a banker here talking about diversity in the water sector, well, I can blame Fabiana for that one. So we had a really good conversation, and we could have kept going a lot longer, but it's in interest of giving everyone else a voice. We'll just cover off what we spoke about. So I'll just run through key topics that we covered. So, and our topic was, I'll just get the wording right, thanks. So how do we increase participation for women in key areas across the water sector? So some of the things we talked about were making sure that each role we're advertising has a gender balanced candidate list. So rather than setting a quota, making sure that we have a balanced candidate list to select from. So you're getting the best candidate, but it's a gender balanced approach. Broadening the selection criteria. So this was particularly relevant for field roles, but also for office roles as well. So instead of having a traditional selection criteria based on experience, which may exclude a diverse candidate profile, actually, taking a fresh approach to the selection criteria, making sure that it's relevant and that we are being inclusive in terms of the selection criteria. Changing the approach for advertising roles to reduce or remove potential gender bias. Engaging more effectively with universities and schools so that you've got a deeper candidate pool and talent pool, again to ensure inclusiveness and diversity. This is probably the most important, but also one of the most difficult to achieve. So having an organisational culture that values inclusiveness and to drive that change. Breaking down the perceived difference between field roles and office roles. Driving, and it talks to culture as well, but driving organisation-wide education in relation to the value of diversity. And we talked about breaking the cycle so that, if you don't have diversity in senior leadership roles, if you don't have diversity in field work, then it's harder to break that cycle, but it's a really important component of that. It's obviously a broader issue as well. And from a retention perspective, making sure that we have flexible working arrangements for staff so that, we can keep experienced and valued staff who need flexible working arrangements for commitments. I hope I've got everything, so thanks everyone.
So now we're going to hear from Kenan. What's happened in your table there?
So thank you, everyone. We had a really engaging discussion around eliminating eliminating the gender pay gap. And we had perspectives around we had some really good perspectives across both the Pacific, the Vietnamese and the Australian contexts. And I'll just speak briefly around some of the opportunities that we saw in each of those areas. So particularly in Vietnam, one of the things that was discussed was around the need for continuing societal and structural barriers that currently inhibit gender pay equity to be overcome. As we saw from the presentation, there's been some fantastic work done around improving female participation in the workforce, around literacy and education, but there continues to be a challenge around the gender pay gap, and particularly was focused around continuing the things like DFAT are doing and organisations to lobby for probably the best way to describe would be further workplace regulation around carers' breaks, opportunities to return to work. Also, the education that needs to continue around the broadening the exposure to women about the role that they can play across a wide range of industries and sectors within Vietnam, and broadening an understanding of the way that of the type of work that women can do to give them more opportunities out of traditional areas and family businesses and the like. So we talked a little bit about the Pacific as well, and particularly around how there is quite a large rate of female participation across industries in the water sector, particularly in the Pacific Rim, so Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Fiji, countries of that nature, and the fact that there is a very low transition rate from lower levels within organisations into senior and top management, and that there is again quite a significant amount of cultural change that needs to be undertaken in those countries in order to basically create opportunities for women and value their contribution in senior leadership roles, and particularly the role of education in that occurring. So that's another opportunity. And in Australia, we just briefly touched on the fact that there has been a significant amount of work done around improving female participation in all levels of work, but we are continuously challenged by, again, similar to our colleagues from other countries, around gender pay equity. And interestingly enough, around how we can continue in the water sector to look at opportunities to promote women going into non-traditional work areas, particularly those that tend to be exposed to more additional types of payments. It's something my organisation, is continuously looking at, and how we can basically get a better pathway into those areas where people might earn more, additional payments and the like, so engineering, technical trade sort of areas. And then also where there is individual discretion, so individuals in more professional roles where they're on contracts, and there's some form of negotiation. There's an element of males having a little bit more confidence and bravado around negotiating rates of pay that may be higher than what females are negotiating, but also how we can value the accumulation of skills where there are constant and continuing career breaks as well for parental and carers' responsibilities. That's something that we seem to always struggle with, is that men present where they've got seemingly great accumulation of skills because they haven't had those breaks. So we talked about opportunities to promote and incentivise actually men taking on more carer responsibilities, which has been a topic that's been coming up more and more. We also talked about basically, around whether we can assist female leaders, managers, executives, professionals and individuals at all levels of organisations around negotiation skills, with discussing pay levels when they join the organisation. And we talked briefly about whether it was possible to narrow the choice around what you might offer a male or a female when they re-enter the workforce or enter. So we threw that around a little bit. When the private sector, where there's greater choice to get the skill you want, there seems to have greater pay equity issues than the government, where there's a narrower opportunity to offer different pay. We thought it becomes a bit of a difficult thing to regulate and police, but what we thought is that it's actually up to leaders to really commit that when they have a male or a female who is starting in a role or coming back into work, they have to actually commit to paying them the same thing. And that's the most important thing, I think, that we came up with.
Thank you very much, Kenan. Now we are going to hear from Rosie.
Thank you very much. So on this table here, we were talking about the encourage the development of more women in leadership. So we had a really great discussion, first of all, about what do we mean by leadership, and it's thinking about the stereotypes that can come with that, and to recognise that leadership is not just a title in a hierarchical sense, and how we really think about opportunities for women in different types of leadership roles. And really our table was quite keen to smash some stereotypes, was really keen to when we think about this conversation about gender equality, we have to talk about power and we have to talk about structural issues. Cynthia pulled out a fact that I didn't know. Am I going too fast? A fact that I didn't know, that nowhere in the world has a water industry got more than 15% of women in the workforce. So we do have to address issues around women coming into the workforce, and we have to accept that some of that is about making space and giving more power to women. So important to be acknowledging and talking about things that have already come up in other groups, the point around flexibility, and I think that might be something, conversations for AWA to be sharing good practice across organisations. A lot of conversation about being really intentional around working with women and that real pipeline, and I think that might come up in another group, for opportunities for women from education throughout their career, and particularly at key transitional points in their career, and to think about how leadership opportunities can be offered that are part-time or job share as well. We also talked a lot about the importance of language, particularly thinking about stereotypes, and to be quite intentional in the language that's used, but also our cultures in our organisations, and the importance of accountability and holding people to account in, for example, their pay discussions, and how leaders are held to account to get transparency in there. We also talked about the importance of leadership at all levels and on boards, to ensure that there is gender balance, but also to really look at why women might not be on boards. I should have said right at the beginning, the key principle we had around this conversation, one of the key principles, that we're not talking about how we need to fix women, we're talking about how we need to address the structural issues that prevent or might be holding women back. And also that we really see women as agents of change and not a vulnerable group that needs some help. And that's a really key thing that we need to be thinking about in all our work in water. We were very lucky in our group that we had Mrs. Tran, who's from the Vietnam's Women Association, and we learnt a tremendous amount about how they have 17 million members. Hopefully I got that right. And one of the key messages from there, the power of building the network, a sense of solidarity, a sense of really how to use social media and the media to promote opportunities and the possibilities for men and women in different roles. And really the importance of women supporting women was a really great story that she had to share. So hopefully, group team, I got our things. So that was some of the conversations that we had so that we can have more women leaders in all their different forms and shapes.
Thank you. Now I'm going to ask Todd Battley to share.
Thanks, Fabiana. Well, our group was focused on flexibility and support for parents at work with children. And we probably opened that up a bit and just talked about flexibility more broadly, because while having kids is great, not everyone has them, and we also care in our care for other people other than children, our ageing parents, as an example, and we certainly have other issues in our lives generally that require flexibility. And so we broadened that out to start with and talked more about flexibility, which a couple of groups have mentioned, and I suppose our group saw that as an enabler. Flexibility is an enabler to enable people to work differently that might lead to more women in leadership, amongst other things. We were really fortunate to have some colleagues from Vietnam that talked about their culture, what flexibility looks like for them, and I think we probably learned a lot in listening to them about how in their culture, caring for kids and caring for each other is a thing that they do as a collective, that families look after each other of all ages and all generations and look after their friends in a way that's quite different than we do here in Australia and perhaps most of the Western world. So that was interesting to hear that. So some of the ideas we had about what might increase flexibility in Australia or New Zealand or the rest of the Western world might not apply to them. But it was great to hear that difference. One of the things that we talked about as a conversation was that flexibility is often determined in organisations with great intent at the top, but it's determined by the quality of the frontline manager. Your boss will determine, generally speaking, how much flexibility actually happens. And you've possibly all heard the conversation around in your team that might be well in other teams, but in our team, our work is special. We couldn't possibly be flexible here. We're way too important for that. So finding a way to empower managers to have better conversations, be able to manage and lead teams by not have to see them all the time is actually a sort of another enabler that we spoke about. We did try and address some of those questions up on the board, and one of the tools that we think is available to everyone that wasn't available 10 years ago or 20 years ago is technology. That certainly enables flexibility in a way that it never did before. And so in many ways, there's not many excuses for us to not at least try to be far more flexible than we are. And we do think the AWA can play a role, because we did mention and talk about that flexibilities both ways, that there are water mains that burst in the middle of the night, and it's no good being too flexible about that. We need it fixed. And so there's going to be times when it is all hands to the pump, forgive the pun, but there's times when the industry or the supply chain needs to be able to respond flexibly. So it's one thing for a client to have a flexible program, but if there's a contractor that doesn't, and a consultant perhaps that doesn't, that's not going to be as effective as all working together. So we do think AWA can play a part in that, and that can be sharing the good stories, but also trying to actively work flexibly where it makes the most sense. And the upside to that, of course, is then having teams readily available to get things fixed when there is no need for flexibility. We need things done. We did discuss, and it was a good point made a couple of times, that when we think about flexibility, often there's an immediate, and particularly when the questions around parents, there's an immediate bias towards that's flexibility for our female staff who'll do the caring, that we need great examples of men and women being flexible in the industry. And in fact, if I use the stat from this table that 15% of the industry is women, then flexibility in this industry, in our industry, needs to absolutely include men as well. It needs to be flexibility for everyone. So we need some good role models of both genders who are taking flexibility up and encouraging it. About a whole bunch of other things, solved a whole lot of other problems, but we might save that for after drinks. So thank you.
Thank you, Todd. So now I invite Lindsey to share your table.
Thanks, everyone. We had a fantastic talk. Our question was about increasing retention of women during the middle stages of their career, which was interesting because we first had to define what we thought that was. And we did that basically after the sort of YWP phase of, after 35, probably in sort of middle management, potentially positions, through that sort of initial sort of learning grad, early career phase, and then into sort of, I guess, independent work, possibly leading a team, possibly not. And it was interesting because so much of what we talked about has already been discussed, of course. Inflexible workplaces were seen as incredibly problematic, and flexible working arrangements were, of course, really championed. But of course, they can't be just for some people. And we really explored the whole idea of flexibility for some and family-centric policies that only account for flexibility for parenting reasons, whereas of course there's lots of other reasons why people might want flexibility, as already been mentioned. And also the impact that can actually have on teams and team dynamics if some people are being treated differently or seem to be treated differently than others, like, oh, we're always having to pick up the slack because so-and-so is only working part-time or this and that. And actually the real remedy to that was having team-based conversations around flexibility. It's like, look, this is what we need to achieve as a team. We have a couple of people in the team who need to work flexibly. How are we going to handle that? And actually empowering managers to have those kinds of conversations and getting teams ready for those types of conversations was seen as a real good way forward. Also trust, and just building trust. You know, one of the things that was seen to keep women out of progressing in their careers was just not being able to have conversations about when things aren't going well, and really not feeling like they're able to say when things are not working for them. So actually being able to have those discussions and encouraging people to step in and talk to someone in their team who's seeming disengaged, so that they can get support and maybe some coaching. Maybe they do need a career break for some reason, but being open to have that trusting, supported conversation. We also saw a role for technology and remote working and the importance of that in promoting flexibility, so I won't go too much into that. Also echoing other people's statements around part-time and job share roles for men and women for a range of personal reasons, and actually particularly in leadership roles. It's wonderful for executives to talk about the importance of flexibility and job share, but how many CEOs actually do it? So it's actually really important to have that modeled at the very highest levels. We talked about things like pay parity and how that can actually provide a financial barrier to women staying in their careers, because of course if families are choosing around who's going to stay home, obviously if pay parity isn't in place, then women will be earning less and will be often chosen as the person to stay home if for whatever reason, and so obviously pay parity is a huge role in keeping women in work. Targets around inclusion, particularly in succession. So it's not just about recruitment, it's actually how are we keeping women in our organization and actually bringing them up and continuing to cultivate them throughout their career. Supporting carers was a really big difference. Having support at home was a really big issue. And again, men in leadership modeling flexibility in carer roles. You know, we need to change the thinking that caring is a woman's job, and really be active as a sector about that. So from AWA's point of view, I guess one of the things that was seen to be really important in terms of our role as an industry association is more examples of women in leadership, of women having successful career transitions, of being valued, and really showcasing what is possible, what can be achieved, and sharing those strategies for success when people have done it really well.
Thank you. I'm going to invite Sandra now to share.
Thank you. And I think I'm the last one standing between you and a cold beverage, so I'll keep it brief. So our challenge today was to address workplace discrimination and the unconscious bias. And the unconscious bias is really the stereotypes we all hold, and everybody is guilty of this. It is a natural coping mechanism to life, a bit of our survival strategy for humanity. But we talked about the things that we would like to change in the workplace, and one of those first things that came up was we need more women. Now, it's not to say that women aren't faulty for unconscious bias, but more women, of course, is the challenge, and we heard some of those percentages that we'd all like to change. We talked about the flexible, family-friendly work environments for everyone in the organisation. We talked about changing the stereotypes that if a woman is standing next to a man, the man's the technical person, but the women are seen as the people persons within that working environment. And we talked about reversing our expectations. You know, why do we ask the women if they drop off? Why aren't we asking the men, are they dropping off the kids and can't make that 8 a.m. meeting? The tools that we talked about was, of course, the blind CVs that we've heard about from other groups. Those the policy changes to the family-friendly, more education encouragement, encouraging more women to look at more technical design roles. Why don't we have reminders about the unconscious bias on our desk? I have a little post-it note on my desk that reminds me to breathe and wait 24 hours before I send that email. Why don't we have a little note on the top of our forms? Remember the unconscious bias. More education and training about the unconscious bias, how we identify it in ourselves of those stereotypes that we're holding on to. We talked about the role that AWA might play, and we very briefly touched on, will we get to an Ozwater where our families attend? There's lots of couples in the water industry that often have to make a decision who gets to go to Ozwater because the other person will have the caring responsibilities. Do we have a creche at Ozwater? Is it something that AWA should be considering? We talked about the best practice and the case studies that somebody else mentioned. And why don't we have a diversity and inclusion award or just a little note in the newsletters to say that this organisation's doing a pretty stellar job? And the network we talked about through all of this was the power that a mentor has. A mentor for women in the workplace or role models for women in the workplace. Mentors that can help us address those unconscious bias. What do we say back to a person that has just, put a bias on me or put a stereotype on me? How do we address that? And yeah, that's all we came up with for now.